Morning, or evening, grace, brethren and sisters. To have all back along with us here with Temperance Awakening, and now looking at our tobacco lecture. This is actually the next to last tobacco lecture that we will have, and then at least we will be through, at least for the time being. We might continue something else here, but just kind of some of our more informative, type of lectures that we have here, talking about tobacco and the dangers and the both physical and social dangers of it, etc. We are nearing the end, and today we will look at tobacco as a gateway product, and then we will also look at the different products of tobacco. And so now getting started here, looking at tobacco as a gateway product. Monitoring the Future, sponsored by NIDA, which is the National Institute on Drug Abuse, is an annual poll of more than 40,000 students for information on their drug use and attitudes. The 2003 survey showed that 25% of students use marijuana, 3.8% took amphetamines, and almost 8% inhaled propellants or solvents. More than one-half of the students surveyed had consumed alcohol in the previous year, and almost one-quarter of the high school seniors surveyed were active smokers. The inclusion of tobacco as a substance to introduce people to illegal drugs explains the term gateway product, as we've mentioned that before a little bit, I think. And like tobacco, just like alcohol, were legal, at least for adults. However, given their addictive and damaging properties, if either had been recently discovered, the FDA, i.e. the Food and Drug Administration, would probably ban them as dangerous. Of course, that might be a bit of a strong opinion there, but that's something that I certainly do believe as well. I think if people had known about the, about the adverse effects of tobacco and alcohol, they never would have been made legal. Because tobacco and alcohol are the most easily obtained, addictive, and brain-altering substances for most teenagers. They're easily available at supermarkets, convenience stores, or gas stations, and all that teenagers need is money and a fake ID, or either a negligent or accommodating store clerk. And, whenever an underage person, let's just think about that there as well. Whenever an underage person learns, to buy, like a carton of cigarettes, dip, chewing tobacco, or, a pack of beer, they're really just learning there how to buy illegal drugs as well. And see, here's some very disturbing numbers about what tobacco use leads to. And it's really, I think, just a reasonable thing, especially for a young person, in our society. If you have, like, a young person trying an illicit product, that's just going to lead to similar experimentation with stronger substances. You just get a taste for it. Especially among a young person, that's using tobacco, something that is illegal for them, because they're underage, they're just going to think, well, then I can try alcohol, I can try marijuana, cocaine, cocaine, heroin, etc. To see a person, can't smoke marijuana until they've done what? They've mastered the mechanics of the cigarette, inhaling smoke and keeping it in the lungs. And there are a lot of stats here, that back this up. In 1986, NIDA released the results of a 10-year study of student attitudes about alcohol and tobacco. According to that research, 18.4% of high school seniors who smoked also drank daily, compared to a drinking rate of 1.7% among non-smoking seniors. Nearly 68% of the seniors who smoked drank heavily, while only 17.2% of non-smoking seniors engaged in heavy drinking. The December 1990 issue of the American Health Journal confirmed those findings with the results of another NIDA study. This survey found that 12 to 17-year-olds who smoked cigarettes were 14 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 100 times more likely to smoke marijuana, and 32 times more likely to use cocaine than their non-smoking peers. See, that's what the numbers are showing. This tobacco just leads to stuff that's worse and more dangerous. A 1994 study by Columbia University Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse also commented on gateway drugs. Based on a survey of 30,000 American households, the researchers found that nearly 90% of cocaine users either smoked tobacco, drank alcoholic beverages, or used marijuana first. Young smokers were found to be 19 times more likely to use cocaine than non-smokers. They were also found to be 13 times more likely to use heroin than young people who didn't smoke. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported in 1995 that teenagers who smoked were 3 times more likely than non-smokers to use alcohol, 8 times more likely to use marijuana, and 20 times more likely to use cocaine. A more recent study sponsored by CASA and the American Legacy Foundation, excuse me, the American Legacy Foundation being a youth-based anti-smoking group released in 2003, found that a majority, that being 57% of teenagers who tried marijuana had smoked cigarettes first. Teenage tobacco smokers were also 14 times more likely to try marijuana than those who had never smoked. Those who smoked were 84% more likely, while there was only about a 6% chance that those who did smoke would use marijuana. A report commissioned by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration found that in 2000, more than one-half, that being 51.7% of 12 to 17-year-olds who smoked daily, had also used illegal drugs within the past month. NIDA research for the same year found that 52% of daily youthful smokers also used illicit drugs. Further, youths who only smoked or only drank alcoholic beverages were 7 times more likely to use drugs than young people who used neither alcohol or tobacco. A 1996 study detailed in the Journal of Addictive Diseases showed that 90% of alcoholics were also smokers. The habit is 3 times more widespread among alcoholics than among the general population. Similar research done by NIDA in 2000 showed that 66% of drug users also smoked. In this case, the smoking rate was more than twice that of the general population. The web of dependencies is complicated and not easy to follow. However, the connections are strong and can easily be found. See, right there with those stats. Because it's just what we can call trying on trouble here. You know, whenever anybody starts tobacco, but especially a young person. Because the mountain of stats on the progression from these gateway substances of tobacco and alcohol to harder drugs certainly doesn't mean that everybody who takes a puff on a cigarette or a sip of a can of beer is going to end up a helpless cocaine addict, but you know, a troubling percentage of young people who experiment with tobacco and or alcohol, you know, they do graduate to more potent and dangerous substances. Consuming alcohol and tobacco can have serious consequences in itself, you know, both long-term and short-term, as we've already looked at. Tobacco can lead to cancer, respiratory ailments, and cardiovascular disease. You know, and then drinking has its own, you know, set of unhelpful and dangerous results, which is actually what we will be looking at next with our lectures. Whenever we finish up tobacco, we'll start looking at alcohol. And several government agencies are attempting to keep stats on young people and the dangerous or unhealthy things that they do. The CDC runs the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, asking 7th through 12th graders questions about everything from drinking to suicide. The National Institute of Child Health and Human Development commissioned the 1995 National Survey of Adolescent Males, a long-term study following the young men from their teen years to adulthood. The NICHD and 17 other federal agencies funded the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health in 1994. To get an overall picture of the ways young people endanger themselves, the Department of Health and Human Services commissioned an analysis of the results from all 3 surveys in 2000. These surveys became known as Teen Risk-Taking, a Statistical Portrait. They examined 10 major forms of risky behavior found in all the government surveys, with an emphasis on risk-taking. And this all had to do with actually we're going to look at that in a moment here about smokers and these other risky behaviors. Not just drugs, but like a couple of other things like fighting and suicide and so forth. But the study, though, found that in general, first just looking at in general here, 54% of the respondents engaged in some form of risky behavior. As the grade levels went higher, so did the percentage of risk-taking teens, as you'd think. Only 19% of 7th and 8th graders engaged in multiple risk. Excuse me. That percentage went up to 36% for high school juniors and seniors. A small percentage, 4%, engaged in 5 or more risky activities. Now, only 11% of the respondents of this were smokers. But out of that group, though, 85% took other risks. So that doesn't just go for drugs, but that just goes for other behavior as well. Like a 35%, talking now about smokers, 35% of smokers also had regular alcohol use, not just drinking, you know, like one time or every once in a while. Were regular drinkers. 40% were regular binge drinkers. 35% used marijuana. 41% of the smokers used other drugs. 17% had been involved in fighting, 21% carried weapons, 19% had suicidal thoughts, 24% had actually tried to commit suicide, and then 25% engaged in unprotected sexual intercourse. So, most of these young people who begin tobacco do that to look experienced and, mature, but as our studies are showing here, whenever you start tobacco, you're just opening the door for other experiments that you do not want. Things that you do not want to experience. And so now we're going to look at the different kinds of tobacco products here. Of course, the main tobacco products are pipe tobacco, snuff, chewing tobacco, cigars, and cigarettes. And so now we will start with snuff or dip. Most of the people that I've been around use the terminology snuff, do that for things like tuberose that older women do, whereas dip, is more like the Copenhagen, Kodiak, Skull, Husky, Longhorn, Grizzly, etc. That men use, like or like powdered, like most of what elderly women use. It's like powdered, type tobacco. And that's the first thing that we'll look at here. Snuff is powdered tobacco that's either snorted up into the nose or dipped, i.e. held in a wad between the lower lip and the gums. And snuff's been around for hundreds of years. In the days before machine manufacturing, snuff was very expensive to produce. Like in the 1600s and 1700s, it was used mainly by the wealthy. Inhaled snuff delivers nicotine, the addictive ingredient of tobacco, to the body through the nasal membranes, the damp skin within the nose. Taking snuff by mouth allows nicotine to pass through the moist skin of the inner lips and gums. Although many people believe that smokeless tobacco, well, at least whenever this kind of smokeless tobacco, when that term first came about in the 70s and 80s, some people believe that was safer than smoking, and some people now, still believe that too. Will say, well, it's not smoking, it's safer. But they're wrong. The researchers have found 28 cancer-causing chemicals in dip tobacco, in dip or snuff. In addition, 1 can of snuff has as much nicotine as 60 cigarettes. Blood tests of those who use smokeless tobacco revealed twice as much nicotine in their blood compared to cigarette smokers. The nicotine dose is so high that many smokeless tobacco companies, they try to get the younger people, to start using brands that don't have as much nicotine. I think like with the U.S. Smokeless Tobacco Company, it's called, they try to get young people first to use Skull, and then as they get older, they get them to use Copenhagen, because Skull is more like candy flavored, like apple type things, whereas Copenhagen is just kind of straight dip. And the amount of nicotine in the regular brands, would make new users sick. That's why they try to get them, into using things that don't have as high a nicotine. And that high nicotine dose also causes difficulty for smokeless tobacco users to quit, because it's so high, it's more addictive. And now looking at chewing tobacco. Through the 1800s and up to the very early 1900s, chewing tobacco was the most popular tobacco product in the U.S. Chewing tobacco is made of shredded tobacco and sold in moist cakes, plugs, or in twist. When held between the gums and the cheek, chewing tobacco delivers nicotine to the skin inside the mouth. Chewing tobacco, of course, kind of like in the 50s, really faded out of popularity, just like with dip and snuff. But recently, though, chewing tobacco and dip and snuff, have made a comeback, kind of like what we said, in the 70s, which we'll look at a little bit later. Along with dip, it's often used by baseball players to keep the mouth moist on hot, dry ball fields. And this much publicized use of the product, plus heightened advertising, convinced some young people that smokeless tobacco was a safe alternative to smoking. One study found that while 77% of students consider smoking dangerous, only 40% thought that smokeless tobacco was dangerous. But chewing tobacco, though, has the same cancer-causing chemicals as snuff does. And a couple of other things that's in chewing tobacco is some very unhealthy ingredients. One is something called formaldehyde. This is a poisonous chemical used to preserve dead flesh and poisonous metals, such as cadmium and lead. One of the less attractive behaviors certainly connected with chewing tobacco, as well as dip and snuff, is the continual need to to spit out the brownish saliva that accumulates in the mouth. It makes me sick just thinking about it. Swallowing can make users sick. When the chewing habit was popular 100 years ago, public places had what they called spittoons, which were spit buckets for collecting this tobacco product, when a lot more people did that, you know, like in the 1800s and the early 1900s. And now looking at cigars. And cigars are chopped tobacco wrapped in tobacco leaves. And very similar, like to chewing tobacco in dip, cigars were very popular in the 1800s, and then in the like mid-1900s, like around the 50s, they also faded out of popularity due to the heightened popularity of cigarettes. But also in the 1990s, they began making a comeback, mainly with people such as Hollywood celebrities, rappers, and like rock musicians advertising them. Like people such as Arnold Schwarzenegger, a very popular Hollywood actor, especially during that time. He made large, expensive cigars part of his public image, smoking them on interview shows while promoting his movies. And then also the very popular football coach Mike Ditka of the Chicago Bears and New Orleans Saints posed with a cigar on the cover of Sports Illustrated in 1998. The better brands of cigars can be very expensive, so they have the reputation of being what we call a status smoke. And an upscale magazine, Cigar Aficionado, if I'm saying that correctly, discusses costly brands that cost about $10 a piece. Less expensive cigars are also smoked in the U.S. This is what's mostly smoked by middle-class people and the younger people. The American Cancer Society's facts and figures for 2003 found that 15% of American high school students tried cigars in the month before the survey. The figures were 22% for boys and 9% for girls. And besides their celebrity boost, cigars have generally not received as much adverse, publicity as cigarettes. As just kind of like with dip and chewing tobacco, some people believe that cigars are less dangerous because the smoke isn't inhaled into the lungs. But cigar smoking, though, still poses very serious health risks. Statistically, male cigar smokers are about 33% more likely to develop cancer than non-smokers. According to the American Cancer Society, cigar smokers have a particular risk of cancer to the mouth, the esophagus, which is the throat, and the larynx, which is the voice box. Their chances of developing these diseases are 4 to 10 times greater than non-smokers. And now here looking at cigarettes, which is still the most popular form of tobacco. Cigarettes are chopped tobacco rolled in paper. In 2001, 425 billion cigarettes were smoked in the U.S. as compared to 1.5 billion large cigars. Because of the large numbers and the large amounts of money involved, the battle over cigarette smoking, is still the focus of efforts to control the use of tobacco. Of course, this has really been controlled now in 2021 pretty well, but whenever people talk about, regulations and restricting, tobacco, that usually has to mostly do with cigarettes. Throughout the 90s, formerly secret documents from tobacco companies became public through leaks or as a result of legal action. Among these is a memo from Brown & Williamson, one of the largest tobacco makers. While the paper discusses the company's 5-year operating cycle through 1998, it mentions that the cost of producing a pack of cigarettes was 19 cents, which is less than a penny per cigarette. In public announcements discussing the price of cigarettes, the tobacco companies contend that they only make 11 cents a pack, with the rest of the money going to federal and state taxes. You multiply that 11 cents by the approximately 20 billion packs sold every year, however, you still get $202 billion, which, is an impressive amount of money by anybody's standard of wealth. In a 1998 report to the American Cancer Society, researchers, though, calculated that tobacco companies really profit closer to 30 cents a pack. And according to this report, as long as tobacco companies can pass along this amount, then cigarettes are going to remain a very profitable business. And now I'm going to look at that, particularly the rise of smokeless tobacco. The official internet site for the U.S. Smokeless Tobacco Company, maker of such brands as Skoal and Copenhagen, like we mentioned, describes the company as the leading producer and marketer of the only growing segment of the U.S. tobacco industry. But see, that's something that is true. Like, I believe that was just, I think, the last lecture. You know, we looked at those stats for cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking has gone down, you know, like, at least in North America. But smokeless tobacco, though, has grown, has gotten more popular. There are more people using that than in previous years, where other, you know, as we said, tobacco products, you know, face declining sales, like cigarettes. Smokeless tobacco continues to expand. In the 1970s, snuff and chewing tobacco were used mainly by old men, 65 years of age and up. However, through by the late 70s, though, and especially through the 80s, smokeless tobacco started to get more popular as people became more aware of the dangers of cigarette smoking. So, like, some smokers, you know, began using chewing tobacco or dipping as a way to get their nicotine without inhaling. And so, always quick to take advantage of that trend, the dip and chew manufacturers renamed their products smokeless tobacco, you know, began promoting them heavily, you know, just giving that insinuation, you know, smokeless tobacco, you know, this isn't as, at least isn't as bad, you know, as smoking cigarettes. And the continuing tradition of oral tobacco in baseball also offered the industry high-profile users. Throughout the 80s, use of the product soared. Between 1972 and 1991, consumption of smokeless tobacco products tripled in the United States. Tripled. By 1991, 8 times as many 17 to 19-year-olds used smokeless tobacco compared to users of the same age in 1972. According to a 2002 national survey on drug use and health, an estimated 7.8 million Americans use smokeless tobacco. Monitoring the future, an annual health survey of young people found that more than 11% of 8th graders and 17% of high school seniors used smokeless tobacco in 2003. And so we ask that question, is it better for you? Smokeless tobacco manufacturers claim that the use of their product is safer than smoking. Users don't draw poisonous smoke into their lungs, so there's no threat of lung cancer. This suggestion seemed to have a deep impression on teenagers, you know, mainly, or we could say, you know, teenagers, maybe to people like in their early to mid-20s. A 1994 report by the Surgeon General, the nation's highest public health official, found that 77% of students consider smoking to be hazardous, but only 40% felt the same way about smokeless tobacco. And that is, yes, you know, we got to be honest, that is, smokeless tobacco is safer in some ways, but safer doesn't necessarily mean safe. You know, like, you can get lung cancer, you know, through dipping or chewing, but it's not safe. And now, you know, like in our time, you know, even the smokeless tobacco companies now have to admit, you know, more than they did previously, like in the 80s and 90s, you know, that there are, you know, serious problems, you know, with smokeless tobacco. Maybe not lung cancer, but you can still get mouth cancer, you know, gum cancer and things through smokeless tobacco. Like I believe I mentioned before, like one of the highest profile cases that came about back, I believe that was the early 80s, was about Sean Marcy. He was a 17-year-old teenager in Oklahoma who was a star athlete. He was a star track. He was a young man who ran track, who had like scholarships to go to colleges and all. But he had used Copenhagen for several years, and I believe it was by the time he was 19, he actually passed away. He had about maybe a 2-year battle or so with mouth cancer. But you can look that up, like Sean Marcy, S-E-A-N, and then Marcy, which is M-A-R-S-E-E. He died from dipping so much Copenhagen because of mouth cancer. And now, speaking of which, looking at those health consequences. Physicians diagnose oral cancer in approximately 30,000 Americans each year. About 75% of those cases can be traced to tobacco, either smoked or smokeless. According to the American Cancer Society, almost 1/2 of the people diagnosed, i.e. 46%, will be dead within 5 years. In nearly 70% of cases, the cancer has spread to lymph nodes and possibly farther through the body by the time a diagnosis is made. In comparison, 173,770 cases of lung cancer are expected in 2004. As we said, although there is a less of a risk for cancer, smokeless tobacco users are still endangering their health. While more Americans end up with lung cancer than oral cancer, death rates for oral cancer haven't really improved, in recent years, like going back 40 years or so, and oral cancers often metastasize before they're discovered. Smokeless tobacco users should also be aware of the warning signs of oral cancer. Sores are a common problem for smokeless tobacco users. However, a sore that bleeds easily and doesn't heal, or a red or white patch in the mouth that doesn't go away, is a cause for concern. Like, that's actually what happened down to, with Sean Marcy. He had, a spot, on his mouth that never went away. The white sores are called leukoplakia, and they're a precancerous condition. Other signs to be aware of include a lump or thickening, anywhere in the mouth, soreness or swelling that doesn't go away, or trouble chewing, swallowing, or moving the tongue or jaw. While good health calls for most people to visit the dentist twice a year, smokeless tobacco users are urged to go about every 3 months for safety's sake. Early detection of oral cancer boosts chances of surviving. Dealing with oral cancer means surgery, which can be disfiguring. Unless the cancer is caught early, surgeons have to take out large sections of the mouth, tongue, or jaw. Once again, like with Sean Marcy, that was the case for him. He had numerous surgeries. I'm sure you can still, I know you can, because I looked it up myself. You can look on images, on Google or Yahoo, just type in his name, and you can see, probably not just him, but I know for sure him, you can see, how disfiguring his mouth was, because, parts of his jaw and everything, were taken out because of the cancer. And, although cancer acted in 1967 to place warnings on packs of cigarettes, it wasn't until 1986, a part of that being because of the Sean Marcy case. In 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed into law a bill requiring a similar warning label on smokeless tobacco products. And buyers may find one of 3 possible labels on those. One warns of oral cancer, another of gum disease and tooth loss, while the third tells users that the product isn't a safe alternative to cigarettes. And lower on the danger scale, but still of concern, are the effects of smokeless tobacco on the teeth and gums, of course, kind of just common knowledge. Nicotine and other chemicals in smokeless tobacco irritate the tissues in the mouth, resulting in bleeding gums and sores, receding gums, gum disease, and lost teeth. Although users of smokeless tobacco soak their teeth in spit laced with sugar used to flavor the tobacco, it leads to tooth decay. And now kind of asking the question about a hidden addiction, as we've already said, to smokeless tobacco. And because, as we said, those medical tests show that smokeless tobacco users carry a much higher dose of nicotine in their blood compared to cigarette smokers. Living with a higher dose of anything, of any drug, means that the user's addiction is stronger. That's certainly going to go with nicotine, heroin, cocaine, or even other things, like sugar. Like people who eat sweets all the time, the more sugar you eat, the more of addiction you're going to have to that. And so boosters of smokeless tobacco, like to compare it to nicotine replacement gums. How users can enjoy it in places where they're not permitted to smoke. But to the gum, however, is supposed to get smokers out of the nicotine habit, not push them deeper into it, which is what dipping or chewing does. And part of the growing trend towards smokeless tobacco may be explained by a comment in the journal Cancer Causes and Control in 2000. It says, although formal studies have not been done, anecdotal evidence suggests that more white-collar workers are using smokeless tobacco. They're typically smokers who are unable to smoke cigarettes due to workplace restrictions. Now, I remember when I was a kid in the 90s, I met some people like that, quite a few actually, like adults, like people who worked in offices. They could no longer, smoke in their office, so they dip tobacco. Smoking isn't allowed, but, you can still have a dip in and, get your cup and spit it in there. And so that certainly was a major trend, back in the 90s, why some white-collar people particularly, switched to chewing or dipping, when they quit cigarettes, because in the 90s, was whenever cigarettes were outlawed in most places. And reports about office use of smokeless tobacco have not just reached the ears of cancer researchers. A March 22, 2004 issue of the Charlotte Observer carried a story about smokeless tobacco products. The first that doesn't require the user to spit. It consists of powdered tobacco inside a tiny paper package. The article reports that although many disliked the new product, one user described it enthusiastically as just the thing for a nicotine fit and a non-smoking environment. Although I don't think that was a product there that really took off, though it never really got a lot of popularity. And so now, like looking at some other things, just to mention here, some products that people may have tried before, and some things that tobacco companies are still trying. As tobacco companies are test marketing and introducing a range of new products, like R.J. Reynolds' Eclipse cigarette has a carbon rod inside the cigarette that heats rather than burns the tobacco. The smoke contains fewer chemicals created by combustion and is supposed to be less harmful. Bryan & Williamson Tobacco has introduced a cigarette called Advanced Lights. It uses tobacco cured under a patented process that is supposed to reduce the creation of cancer-causing compounds. The cigarettes also feature a 3-part filter, each section aimed at straining out a particular toxic chemical. Vector Tobacco is also claiming to reduce carcinogens with its Omni cigarettes. At least 2 varieties of smokeless tobacco, one produced in the U.S. and the other from Sweden, are being marketed as providing a reduced risk of cancer. And from my knowledge, none of these products here got very popular. And we're going to ask the question, are they safer? This is probably why. See, these companies are making the claims that these products would be safer. And like some of these, like tests, and things that they had claiming that they're safer, some were done in-house and others were by independent laboratories. And see, anti-tobacco proponents are going to remember the 1950s, or if you've studied about that at all, some of you younger people aren't going to be familiar with this. But in the 1950s, though, that was a time when cigarette manufacturers made extravagant claims about the health benefits of filtered cigarettes. That's when that came about in the 50s. And then also, the last wave, well, maybe not the last wave now, but another big wave of tobacco innovation, like in the 1970s, was the low-tar, low-nicotine brands. That's something, that came out because of a lot of these claims that began in the 60s, whenever they began being publicized against tobacco. See, the government tested these, what they call light cigarettes, on special smoking machines. When the machines registered lower levels of dangerous materials, millions of consumers switched to these new, supposedly healthier cigarettes. Unfortunately, though, see, the problem is humans aren't machines. They don't smoke the way machines do. You smoke because you have an addiction to nicotine. And since they weren't getting the amount of nicotine they were used to from the new cigarettes, smokers puffed much harder on them, defeating the purpose of these filters. In fact, smokers actually inhaled more smoke and tar much deeper into their lungs, because it was a light cigarette. So it took years for the bad effects to become obvious, and the episode shows that even when the government tries to come up with an objective test for cigarettes, it just, doesn't succeed. And so we'll stop off there, and whenever we come back, in our next class, our next lecture, we're going to be looking at withdrawals. And we're going to also be looking at women and smoking. So those will be the last 2 things that we look at for our last lecture here, at least for the time being, about tobacco. So thank you so much there for being with us, and so hopefully what we've put out has been informative and a help to you there, and if we can help you in any way, our email address is right there, amen. And so until the next lecture, we'll see you then. Until the day breaks and the shadows flee away, I am Dr. Cooper, and I love you, and I appreciate you.